My name is Lissa Weinman, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of Windham World Affairs Council. It's a great group to be part of. I see a lot of new faces tonight. We meet monthly, and we put on great programming every month that's free to the public. So thank you for being here tonight. So we're here really honored to have Dr. Jourdy here with us tonight, and Lee Schlenker from Witness for Peace, to talk about the state of socialism in Cuba today. I have to say that one of our interns did the poster for tonight's event, and I thought it was beautiful, but then I thought, you know, it's always the old cars, and it really implies that socialism itself is an old concept and that somehow Cuba is stuck in the past. Well, as someone who's worked with Cuba for the past 20 years or so, I have to say that I don't think that's true. I think that's very far from the truth. The kinds of things that I've seen happening in Cuba, I think, are very modern, and I think Cuba's actually quite ahead of its time in some of the ways that it's approaching its economy, approaching the quality of life of its people, and really exceeding expectations in terms of life expectancy, in terms of different healthcare standards, educational levels. But all of that is really being threatened like never before now with the continued imposition of the U.S. embargo, almost 40 years now, the most stringent embargo, unilateral economic embargo in United States history. So this country has struggled for so long and has really remained true to its ideals, but is facing a very important moment now. And we're so fortunate to have Dr. Jourdy here to share the state of affairs with us. I'd like to now introduce Lee Schlenker. He's the regional organizer for Witness for Peace New England. Witness for Peace is a national organization that's responsible for bringing Dr. Jourdy all around. She's going to be in Washington next week for some solidarity days with Cuba that Lee will tell you about. So without any further ado, Lee, could you please tell us a little bit about Witness for Peace and then introduce us to Dr. Jourdy?
I have the mic here. So
you do? Okay.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. All right, well, thank you so much once again for the invitation to have us here in Brattleboro on this national tour in solidarity with the Cuban people. Once again, my name is Lee Schlenker. I'm a regional organizer with Witness for Peace New England. I've actually lived and worked as a member of the Cuba International team in Havana, Cuba with the Martin Luther King Center for 3 years. Witness for Peace has recently undergone a organizational restructuring, and we're called now the Solidarity Collective. So you can find more information about our organization at solidaritycollective.org. But our organization has been around for 35 years, working in solidarity with grassroots movements throughout the Americas and the Caribbean to have a permanent a presence, essentially, per invitation by grassroots movements who feel the need, due to aggressive and hostile U.S. policies and corporate practices, to have physical international accompaniment at all times for their safety and because of the ways in which these policies affect their sovereignty and self-determination as movements and as people's struggles. So a little bit about our Cuba program. We've been in collaboration with the Martin Luther King Memorial Center in Havana for the past 20 years. We lead 12 to 15 people-to-people solidarity delegations every year, as well as these annual speakers tours and legislative action that Lisa spoke about. We'll be participating in the National Days of Action Against the Blockade in Washington, D.C., in which Dr. Jourdy will be able to meet with many representatives in Congress, as well as participating in the national meeting of the National Network of Cuba, which is the annual coalition sort of gathering or solidarity encuentro that we call it, in which we set the agenda for the year for the Cuba solidarity groups throughout the nation. So once again, I know you just heard a pitch for donations, but it's inevitable with grassroots organizations like ours that rely on the generosity and grassroots funding of folks like yourselves. We don't receive any money from the government, from any private companies or any large foundations. So in order to cover our costs, which especially for this tour, we had to buy at least 3 round-trip flights, exorbitantly high visa costs just to be able to get a speaker like Dr. Jourdy here to the United States. We can talk more about the closure of the U.S. Embassy in Havana and the backtracking of U.S.-Cuba relations in the diplomatic sense. But really, it's been quite a struggle to get these unique perspectives that we're all so grateful for and that we never hear in a public forum like this in the United States. So if folks are interested in learning more about our organization or contributing, we have a table outside with artesanía, sort of arts and crafts, with books, literature from Cuba in Spanish and in English, as well as other information about U.S.-Cuba history, relations, and our upcoming delegations. So please make sure you sign in and take all the information that you'd like to be able to learn more and to continue standing in solidarity with the Cuban people. So without further ado, I'd like to read the bio for our distinguished guest here.
Thank you.
So Dr. Jourdy Victoria James Heredia received her PhD in Economic Sciences from the University of Havana and her PhD in Economic Sciences from the University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. She is the subdirector and lead researcher of the Global Economy Research Center in Havana, Cuba, and an associate professor at the University of Havana. She's a member of the editorial group of Cuba's World Economic Issues Journal and of the Foreign Policy Experts Group organized by Cuba's Higher Institute for Foreign Relations. She has won the annual prize of the Cuban Academy of Sciences on 2 occasions, in 1999 and 2000, and the EU LAC Foundation Prize in 2015. She has over 30 years of experience researching issues of European integration, and she is the author of numerous articles in both national and international journals, as well as 2 books entitled The Eurozone Crisis, Economic Foundations and Lessons for Latin America, as well as Food Security in the European Union, Latin America, and the Caribbean, The Cases of Cuba and Spain. She has lectured in universities throughout the world, including in Spain, Jamaica, Canada, Germany, China, and Kenya. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to our distinguished guest, Dr. Jourdy Victoria James Heredia.
Thank you for coming. I am happy to stay. I am happy to be here with you, the Cuban friends. No? But today we are talking about the Cuban economy. Yes. Lee is going to help me with traduction. No? I can say this. Mm-hmm. Yes. Bien. Nosotros vamos a hablar hoy un poquito de la economía cubana.
So today we'll speak a bit about the Cuban economy.
Yo incluso he organizado la presentación en 4 momentos.
So we will structure the presentation in 4 different moments.
Evidentemente, el último tiene que ver con las conclusiones, pero las conclusiones yo las voy a ir dando en la medida que vaya exponiendo.
So the conclusions that I'll be making will come throughout the presentation.
Por favor. Por ejemplo, vamos a hablar qué pasó en Cuba después de la ruptura del campo socialista.
So the first moment of the presentation will be about what happened with Cuba after the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
En un segundo momento estaríamos hablando del proceso de actualización de la economía cubana.
In the second moment of the presentation, we'll be speaking about the updating process of the Cuban economy today.
Voy a dar una breve panorámica sobre algunos de los principales indicadores macroeconómicos de Cuba hoy, pero va a ser muy breve.
The third moment of the presentation will be a brief overview of some of the major macroeconomic indicators of the Cuban economy, which will be quite brief.
Y en un cuarto momento estaría hablando del bloqueo.
And then in the fourth moment of the presentation, I'll be speaking about the U.S. blockade on Cuba.
Es bueno incluso decir que no es la primera vez que se actualiza el modelo económico cubano.
So it's important to note that this is not the first moment of updating of the Cuban economy that we've had.
Nosotros lo actualizamos cuando desapareció la Unión Soviética, lo estamos actualizando ahora y quizás sigamos actualizando el modelo económico cubano.
So we had to update the Cuban economy after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. We're continuing to update the economy today, and I can dare to say that we will probably have to update the economy in a future moment as well.
Cuando desapareció el campo socialista, Cuba se vio enfrentada a una crisis de grandes proporciones.
So when the socialist bloc of countries went away, Cuba experienced a crisis of great dimensions.
Por ejemplo, una crisis del aparato productivo, una crisis alimentaria, una crisis energética, tuvimos la ausencia de divisa también convertible.
So there was a crisis in the energy sector, in the food system, in the productive apparatus, and also we had a terrible situation in terms of access to foreign hard currency.
Cuba sufrió un impacto económico muy grande.
So Cuba suffered an economic impact that was quite large.
Por ejemplo, entre 1990 y el 93, el Producto Interno Bruto cubano cayó un 35%.
So from the years 1990 to 1993, the Cuban GDP dropped over 35%.
Para Cuba, incluso la gran discusión que había internacional, a nivel internacional por los grandes economistas, era que era muy difícil quizás mantener el crecimiento económico y el proyecto social de Cuba en esas condiciones. Es decir, que Cuba a lo mejor tendría que recurrir a alguna institución financiera internacional.
So the great debate at the time among international economists was how could Cuba survive such a crisis of such great dimensions and maintain its socialist form of development without having to go towards a large international financial institution like the IMF for a loan.
Pero la dirección del país en aquel momento, encabezada por Fidel, le habló al pueblo.
But the leadership of the country at the time, led by Fidel, spoke quite clearly to the public.
Y le dijo al pueblo que el momento que venía era muy difícil.
And what he said to the people of Cuba was that the moments to come were to be quite difficult.
Y que debíamos resistir para mantener nuestro proyecto social.
And that we had to continue to resist in order to maintain our social project.
Y construir el socialismo.
And to be able to continue to build socialism.
En esa etapa incluso hubo una reducción importante de las importaciones. Ahí ustedes la ven, de 8.000 millones de dólares a 1,7 mil millones de dólares.
During this period, we had a drastic loss in imports to the country as well, which dropped from $8 billion to $1.7 billion over the course of 4 years.
Y fue una drástica reducción porque Cuba prácticamente importa el 75% de sus alimentos y del petróleo.
And this was a drastic reduction in imports because Cuba relies on 70% of its fuel and food consumption on imports.
En esa etapa incluso nosotros perdimos nuestros principales socios comerciales.
So in this moment, Cuba lost all of its main trade partners.
Es decir, la mayor parte del vínculo económico de Cuba, comercial, estaba con los países del campo socialista, casi un 75%.
So almost 75% of Cuba's foreign trade is with the countries of the socialist bloc.
Y por tanto lo perdimos todo.
And so at that moment, we lost pretty much everything.
Cuba se vio expuesta a la economía mundial.
Cuba found itself exposed to the world economy.
Y tenía incluso que insertarse a partir de ese momento en la economía mundial y buscar nuevos mercados.
And so Cuba had to find itself inserting itself into the global economy at the time and finding new trade partners.
Bueno, ¿y cuáles fueron las principales medidas tomadas en aquel momento?
So what were the major measures that were taken at that time to confront the crisis?
Por favor. Primero, se despenalizó el uso del dólar dentro de Cuba.
The first thing that was done was the depenalization of the ownership of dollars in the Cuban economy.
Para dar paso a la inversión extranjera directa también y el turismo.
Which was also a measure taken to be able to open up the economy to foreign direct investment and to tourism.
Se abrieron las casas de cambio dentro de la isla.
So within the island, we also opened up the money exchange houses as well.
En la medida que se desarrollaba el turismo y la inversión extranjera directa, todo aquel que llevaba a Cuba con divisa dura, es decir, con las divisas mundiales hoy importantes, euro, dólar, libra esterlina, podía cambiarla en las casas de cambio por el peso cubano o el CUC, que es un nuevo signo monetario que se introduce también en esta etapa del periodo especial.
Okay, so during this moment, what Cuba did through the opening of this money exchange houses was allowing foreigners who came either as investors or tourists with their foreign currency to exchange that currency for the Cuban peso or for a new monetary symbol that we had to create at the time, which was the CUC.
Es importante decirle que en aquel momento cuando Fidel nos habló, dijo que estábamos en presencia del periodo especial en tiempo de paz.
So it's important to note that Fidel spoke clearly to the people at this time and said that we are in the midst of a special period in times of peace.
En ese momento también se introdujo el trabajo por cuenta propia y el autoempleo.
At this moment, we also allowed for self-proprietorship in the island, as well as small private businesses to emerge.
Y se fueron creando las cooperativas en la producción.
And we
el
also
sector agropecuario.
allowed for cooperatives in the agricultural sector to begin as well.
Por favor. Bueno, ¿y cuáles fueron los principales resultados de estas medidas?
And so what were the major results of these measures?
Es que a partir de 1994 comienza a crecer el Producto Interno Bruto cubano.
So it's after the year 1994 that the Cuban GDP started to grow again.
Ya aparece el turismo como una de nuestras principales variables dentro de la economía.
Tourism then became a major variable within the island economy.
Hay incluso análisis estadísticas estimados que se hacen que entre 1994 y el 2009 el Producto Interno Bruto cubano creció a una tasa de un 4%.
So our studies show that from 1994 to 2009, the Cuban GDP grew a total of 4.4%.
Por ejemplo, aunque ustedes ven las transformaciones en la agricultura, cómo la propiedad estatal va dando paso a la propiedad cooperativa dentro de la agricultura.
So as you can see here on the screen, there have been major changes that occurred in the agricultural sector as well. For example, large state farms were handed over to farmers themselves to own the land, and thus we can see the increase from 10.2% to 58% in cooperatively owned farms.
Y en ese momento incluso surge en esa etapa la creatividad y la innovación de la población en Cuba.
And in this moment, we also saw the emergence of the creativity and innovation of the Cuban people.
Los cubanos, donde quiera que en las zonas urbanas, en las ciudades, había un pedacito de tierra, comenzaron a plantar determinados hortalizas, vegetales, que eran de fácil recuperación, que nosotros le llamamos los organopónicos.
So at this moment, Cubans in any vacant lot or area in their homes that they had to grow food started to do so, so we started to see the development of organic urban cooperative farms filled with vegetables, fruits, fruit trees, etc.
El Estado, como Cuba es un proyecto de participación social, el Estado organizó los organopónicos y fue capaz de llevarlo también a las zonas suburbanas.
And so because Cuba is a project of mass social participation, what happened after these grassroots initiatives emerged was the state was able to organize them, give them support, and then bring them to other areas outside of the cities.
Incluso a mí me gusta decir, cuando doy estas conferencias, de que en ese momento los cubanos comenzamos a alimentarnos mejor.
So I like to say in my lectures that it was at this moment that Cubans even learned to start eating better.
Empezamos a comer vegetales.
We started to eat vegetables.
Sí, porque nosotros estábamos acostumbrados al con gris, la yuca y el bistec de puerco.
So Cubans were used to just a plate of rice and beans, pork and yuca.
Recuerdo incluso que surgieron los nutriólogos. Los cubanos, como siempre estamos atrás del nuevo conocimiento, empezamos a leer que también los vegetales eran importantes incluso para mantener la salud y que incluso daban mayor calidad de vida.
And so this is when, during the special period, we started to have the whole field of nutrition that came into Cuba, and we learned about the dietary value of eating healthy fruits and vegetables and including it in our diet.
Por favor. Y entonces, ¿por qué nosotros en los 2000, incluso después de la crisis del 2008, nosotros incluso allá en Cuba, cuando hacemos los análisis dentro de mi centro, analizamos a esa crisis del 2008 como una crisis global, que si bien empieza en los Estados Unidos por el boom, es decir, por el estallido de la burbuja inmobiliaria de las hipotecas subprime, se extiende a todas partes del mundo.
So in my center, we analyzed after the 2008 global recession and the burst of the housing bubble due to the subprime mortgage crisis, that this crisis didn't just affect the countries of the developed world, but also spread throughout and affected Cuba too.
Sí, de manera indirecta, Cuba se vio afectada.
And so in an indirect way, Cuba was quite affected.
¿Y por qué yo digo que hoy es necesario actualizar el modelo económico cubano?
And so it was after this moment that we realized that it was necessary to update the Cuban economy once again.
En primer lugar, porque hay un conjunto de elementos tanto externos como internos que determinan la necesidad del ajuste.
And so first off, we must discuss both the internal and the external factors after this crisis that led us to realize why we needed an adjustment of the economy again.
Por ejemplo, primero vamos a hablar de los externos.
So let's talk about the external factors first.
Por ejemplo, Cuba está construyendo su socialismo en una etapa del predominio del capitalismo a nivel mundial.
The first external factor that's quite important to understand was that Cuba was building its socialism in the midst of a predominance of global capitalism.
Por tanto, Cuba no puede vivir a espaldas del mercado.
So Cuba realized that it couldn't live with its back to the global market.
Y hoy la política de Cuba es establecer relaciones con todos los países del mundo, independientemente del sistema económico que tengan, socialista o capitalista.
And so now Cuba's official foreign policy is to try to develop relations with countries throughout the world, every country possible, independent of its economic system, socialist or capitalist.
Y por otro lado, el bloqueo.
Another external factor was the U.S. blockade.
Fíjense, hay algo que quizás no le dije, pero que en la etapa más difícil de Cuba, de los años 90, se intensificó el bloqueo a Cuba.
So maybe I didn't mention this before, but during the most difficult period of Cuba's economic tension in the special period, there were two new U.S. laws that strengthened the blockade towards Cuba.
Con la ley Torricelli de 1992 y la ley Helms-Burton de 1996.
And these two laws were the Torricelli Act of 1992 and the Helms-Burton Act of 1996.
Y desde el punto de vista interno, hay un conjunto de factores, como por ejemplo, si Cuba es bien la isla más grande del Caribe, evidentemente tiene escasez de recursos naturales.
And so those are the external factors, but for the internal factors, we must realize that Cuba, even though it's the largest island in the Caribbean, has a scarcity of natural resources.
Y también porque en esa época, evidentemente, el gobierno explicó en asamblea las principales dificultades internas que Cuba estaba teniendo.
And also internally, the Cuban government explained to us in our parliament the numerous internal difficulties that we were living inside of the country.
Los problemas de eficiencia,
Problems of economic inefficiency,
los problemas de la baja productividad del trabajo,
low work productivity as well,
los problemas de la coordinación quizás entre empresas,
the coordination or lack thereof of state enterprises,
y por último, que había que equilibrar quizás hasta cierto punto el déficit presupuestario.
and also the need to balance to a certain extent the budget deficit of the state.
El Estado iba a seguir participando en la economía,
So the state was of course going to keep participating in the economy,
en los principales sectores,
in the main sectors of the economy,
y por supuesto iba a mantener su proyecto de gasto social y del ser humano en el medio del proceso.
and of course the state would continue its project of social spending and keeping the human being at the center of all economic decisions.
Ahora vamos a ver cuáles son las principales líneas de la actualización actual.
But given these factors, we must now analyze what are the three major elements of this second process of updating of the Cuban economy.
Por favor. Pudieran ser más, pero para un mejor entendimiento de este tema, a mí me gustaría dividirlo en tres líneas fundamentales.
So there might be even more elements that I could divide this section into, but for a better understanding of the issue at hand, I'd like to divide it into three major
Fíjense
subsections.
bien. El primero tiene que ver con los cambios en la gestión y estructura de la propiedad.
So the first major change in the updating of the Cuban economy has to do with the recomposition of the structure and management of property.
En este sentido, el Estado arrendará determinados espacios a los privados para el desarrollo de determinados servicios como peluquería, barbería, cafetería.
So under this section, we note that the state began to rent out certain locales and properties that it had to small-scale private actors. And this is the case of new small-scale private barbershops, hairdressers, cafeterias, and etc.
Y también el surgimiento de las cooperativas no agropecuarias también en Cuba.
And there was also the emergence of non-agricultural cooperatives that emerged in the economy as well.
También los cambios en la magnitud y presencia del Estado en la economía.
The second element has to do with the magnitude and presence of the state in the economy.
Por ejemplo, el Estado dio paso al surgimiento de nuevos ministerios,
So the state opened up for new ministries or federal level departments.
como el Ministerio de la Industria, el Ministerio de Energía y Minas.
There's the Ministry of Industries that was created, the Ministry of Energy and Mines as well.
Se fusionaron otros ministerios,
Other ministries were combined,
como el Ministerio del Comercio Exterior y el Ministerio de la Inversión Extranjera.
such as the Ministry of Foreign Trade and the Ministry of Foreign Direct Investment.
Aquí comienza a dársele mayor independencia a las empresas al interior del país.
Under the second subsection, we can see the independence that was granted to state-run companies.
Podemos encontrar en Cuba empresas estatales socialistas que pueden ser presupuestadas puras y también pueden ser empresas autofinanciadas.
So this change had to do with the structure of socialist state enterprises. So now we have state-budgeted socialist enterprises which receive all their financing from the state, and then we also have self-financed socialist state enterprises which are able to cover their costs with their incomes.
Muy bien. Y el último tiene que ver con los cambios en la forma de financiar el déficit presupuestario.
And the third major change has to do with the way that we financed the fiscal deficit.
A nosotros los economistas nos gusta decirlo así,
So us economists like to say it this way.
pero a mí me gustaría decirlo que aumentan las oportunidades de la población en Cuba.
But I would like to say it in another way, which is the increase of the opportunities available to the Cuban people.
Por ejemplo, surge la ley de migración en Cuba en el 2013, donde todos los cubanos pueden viajar a cualquier parte del mundo, solamente necesitan una visa.
So one example of this is the new migration law that was passed in 2013, in which Cubans can now travel to any country in the world that they'd like, so long as the receiving country grants them a visa.
Por ejemplo, surge el mercado de la vivienda, ya los cubanos pueden comprar y vender sus casas y también rentar sus casas.
So another element is the new housing market that was allowed and opened up in Cuba, in which Cubans can now buy and sell their homes as well as rent their homes to those who visit.
También el mercado del transporte.
There's also a new transportation market that was allowed.
Miren, en el mercado de transporte nosotros podemos ver las tres formas de propiedad en Cuba.
So in the transportation market, we can see the three types of property that now exist in Cuba.
La propiedad pública, estatal,
There's public state property,
la propiedad cooperativa
cooperative property,
y la propiedad privada.
and also private property.
Pero cuando ustedes ven ese análisis de estas líneas fundamentales de la actualización, hay un conjunto de medidas que quizás van a liberalizar un poco el mercado. Incluso ahí se introducen mecanismos de mercado en la economía.
So when you see all of these elements, these market mechanisms that were introduced into the economy, you might think, oh, Cuba's just moving towards a path of liberalization of its economy.
Y a nivel internacional incluso hay una gran discusión de que Cuba va camino al capitalismo.
And on an international level, there's a huge debate going on saying that Cuba is just moving down the path towards capitalism.
Pero eso no es verdad.
But that's not true.
Cuba va a construir el socialismo.
Cuba will continue to build socialism.
Lo que pasa es que en esta etapa de la economía cubana se necesitan esos mecanismos de mercado, pero no son preponderantes.
And so we say this because in this moment, to continue to build and grow the Cuban economy, we need these small-scale market mechanisms. But what we have to clarify is that these mechanisms are not predominant in the economy.
Predominante es la empresa estatal socialista.
The major element of the Cuban economy continues to be the socialist state enterprise.
Además, nuestra planificación también es socialista.
We also continue to have a socialist planning of the entire economy.
En este sentido, lo que queremos darle una mayor quizás libertad a las empresas y quizás el Estado intervenir en el producto final indirectamente. Pero el modelo como tal es socialista. No es la planificación centralizada de cuando la Unión Soviética.
So our state planning now, it's not as centralized as it used to be during the Soviet Union times, but what we're embarking on a process of is allowing for state enterprises to have more independence and autonomy in their production. Maybe the state will intervene at the end to make sure that the production has fair prices and other decisions like that, but we still have socialist state planning of the economy.
Hoy nuestra planificación es financiera.
And today our state planning looks mostly like financial planning.
Es decir, porque tenemos que también ir a homologar también nuestra contabilidad a las condiciones internacionales.
And that's because we have to get our accounting and financial standards up to those of the rest of the world to be able to trade with the rest of the world.
Por favor. Entonces, vamos a hablar, como le dije, de una breve panorámica de los principales indicadores macros de la economía cubana.
So now we're going to talk about a couple of brief macroeconomic indicators of the economy.
Miren, entre el 2011 y el 2015, la economía cubana creció a tasas de un 2%.
So from the years 2011 to 2015, the Cuban economy grew about 2%.
Y a partir del 2016 comienza a disminuir el crecimiento económico.
And then in the year 2016, we saw a decline in the growth of the GDP.
Hay un conjunto de factores que están limitando hoy el crecimiento económico en Cuba.
But we must discuss a number of limiting factors that are preventing the growth of the GDP.
Por ejemplo, el petróleo.
First one is oil.
Ustedes conocen el bloqueo que tiene Venezuela.
You might know about the blockade that the U.S. has on Venezuela.
Y los vínculos incluso que tiene con Cuba con relación al intercambio de los servicios médicos, y sobre la base de eso también Cuba recibe el petróleo venezolano.
And you might also know about the relations that Cuba has with Venezuela, in which Cuba is able to receive Venezuelan oil in exchange for the doctors and teachers that Cuba sends to Venezuela in exchange.
Porque ustedes saben que esto tiene un antecedente,
Because you know this has an antecedent, right?
Y eso tiene que ver con que Cuba también presta sus servicios médicos al mundo, no solamente a Venezuela.
And what this has to do with is that Cuba doesn't just send its medical services to Venezuela, but also to the rest of the world.
Por ejemplo, estuvo en Brasil con el programa Más Médicos.
Cuba's doctors were in Brazil with the More Doctors program.
También tenemos la brigada Henry Reed para cualquier desastre que haya a nivel internacional. Los primeros en llegar son los médicos cubanos.
Cuba also has the Henry Reeve Brigade, in which its brigade of doctors go to any part of the world which has experienced a natural disaster, and Cuban doctors are the first one to arrive.
Incluso Cuba ha llevado su solidaridad al resto del mundo y creó en los años 90 la Escuela Latinoamericana.
And so another example of this is in which Cuba has showed solidarity with the rest of the world by opening in the late 90s the Latin American School of Medicine in Havana.
Para formar allí los médicos para que después puedan servir a sus comunidades pobres en el mundo.
To be able to train doctors so that they can go back to their communities and serve poor people who don't have medical access there.
Por tanto, ya vamos por la 15 graduación de la Escuela Latinoamericana de la Salud.
We've already had 15 graduations of this Latin American School of Medicine.
Y para no desviarme, voy a hablar del otro elemento que es importante.
And so to not get off track, I would like to go to the next limiting factor preventing Cuba's GDP growth in the recent years.
Tiene que ver incluso con el déficit fiscal.
Which has to do with our fiscal deficit.
Hoy se ha elevado un poco el déficit fiscal, teniendo en cuenta que lo teníamos alrededor de un 3% del Producto Interno Bruto.
So our fiscal deficit has raised in the past couple of years, more so than the level of 3%, which is recommended.
Sin embargo, se ha elevado, pero por una causa justa, noble.
So, but our fiscal deficit has increased because of a just and noble cause.
Y es porque el Estado está invirtiendo para el desarrollo económico de Cuba.
And that's because the state is investing a lot of money for economic development within Cuba.
Está invirtiendo en la zona especial de desarrollo del Mariel.
It's investing in the Special Economic Development Zone at Mariel.
En sectores tan importantes como la agricultura.
It's investing in strategic sectors such as agriculture.
Y hay otro elemento que no puede faltar en el análisis a la hora de analizar, incluso de hacer un análisis estructural de la economía cubana o coyuntural.
And there's another analysis that cannot be missing when we're making a structural analysis of the Cuban economy today.
Que tiene que ver con las condiciones climatológicas adversas.
Which has to do with adverse climatological factors.
Miren, en la temporada entre el 1 de junio y el 30 de noviembre, Cuba casi siempre es azotada por un fenómeno meteorológico.
So from the beginning of June through the end of November, Cuba every year is always hit by some sort of adverse climatological phenomenon.
Por ejemplo, el que más recuerdo ahora fue el huracán Irma del 2017,
So the one that I remember most recently was Hurricane Irma in 2017,
que trajo pérdidas a Cuba por más de 13.000 millones de dólares.
which brought losses to Cuba of over $13 billion.
Y en el sector de la vivienda fueron afectadas más de 158.000 viviendas en Cuba.
And in the housing sector, there were losses of over 158,000 homes.
Por favor. Ahora, vamos a analizar el bloqueo.
But now we have to analyze the U.S. blockade on Cuba.
Cuando yo hago el análisis del bloqueo en Cuba, casi nunca pongo los antecedentes.
So when I do an analysis of the blockade, I don't always bring the antecedents of the blockade into the picture.
Pero en las actuales circunstancias es imprescindible conocer cuáles fueron los antecedentes.
But in the current situation that the economy is undergoing, it's indispensable to bring these antecedents to understand the present.
Importante conocer cómo en 1960 se reduce la cuota azucarera de Cuba en el mercado norteamericano.
It's very important to note that as of 1960, the Cuban sugar quota, in which Cuba sent a certain amount of sugar assured to the U.S. market, was drastically reduced.
En ese año también comienzan las nacionalizaciones en Cuba
In this year, there was also the nationalizations of large private properties in Cuba.
y se produce en abril del 61 la invasión a Playa Girón.
And as a result of those nationalizations, in 1961, there was the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba,
donde realmente triunfó la Revolución Cubana.
in which we saw a great triumph of the Cuban Revolution.
Entre octubre de 1961 y los primeros meses del 62 también se da la crisis de los misiles o crisis de octubre.
And in the last few months of 1961 and into the first months of 1962, we experienced the Cuban Missile Crisis, or as we call it, the October Crisis,
Que también fue resuelta por la Unión Soviética y el gobierno estadounidense.
which was eventually resolved by the government of the Soviet Union and that of the Kennedy administration.
Y en febrero de 1962 ya se implanta el bloqueo económico a Cuba.
And then in the beginning of 1962 is when the U.S. blockade against Cuba was finally imposed,
Con impacto en todos los sectores económicos y en la vida del pueblo cubano.
which had impacts in all sectors of the Cuban economy and, most importantly, an impact on the daily lives of all Cubans.
Por favor. Entonces, vamos a ver por qué el bloqueo hoy en la actualidad tiene un componente, y siempre lo ha tenido a partir de los 90, extraterritorial.
But now we must discuss why, as of the early 90s, the U.S. blockade towards Cuba acquired an extraterritorial component.
Eso quiere decir que ya no se circunscribe solamente a Cuba, sino a terceros países.
What this means is that the blockade now doesn't just affect Cuba, but also third countries as well.
Por ejemplo, prohíbe a las subsidiarias de empresas norteamericanas ubicadas en terceros países tener un vínculo comercial con empresas cubanas o económico.
For example, the Torricelli Act prohibits any company based in any subsidiary of U.S. companies based in third countries from having any sort of trade relationships with Cuba.
Incluso prohíbe ya a las empresas de terceros países exportar a Cuba productos que en su materia prima tengan componentes de origen, que no sea superior, no puede ser superior a un 10% en cuanto a materia prima estadounidense.
And so this law also prohibited any companies in third countries from exporting to Cuba any product that had original component parts or raw materials of more than 10% coming from the United States.
Así como no permite que esas empresas exporten a Estados Unidos algún producto que tenga algún componente en cuanto a materia prima de origen cubano.
And vice versa, so any company in a third country that wants to export a product to the United States cannot do so if that product has any raw materials coming from Cuba.
Y un elemento importante tiene que ver con los buques.
And another element that was prohibited in this law has to do with ships.
Por ejemplo, prohíbe que aquellos barcos que vengan con productos petróleos a Cuba no podrán tocar el puerto norteamericano después de 6 meses.
So this law also prohibited
Antes de los 6 meses.
any ships who touch Cuban ports from then entering into a U.S. port within the span of 6 months.
Eso quiere decir que prácticamente ha puesto a competir al mercado cubano con el mercado estadounidense. Estamos hablando, en el caso de Estados Unidos, del mercado más grande del mundo, donde prácticamente un 70% de su Producto Interno Bruto es consumo.
So what we're talking about here is a law that puts the Cubans up against to compete against the US market. And so a US market in which it's the largest in the world, of course, as well as a market that's made up of 70% of its GDP consumption alone.
Pero con todo, Cuba está recibiendo también la inversión extranjera directa de otros países.
But nonetheless, Cuba continues to receive foreign direct investment from other countries.
Y por tanto, una vez el que incumpla con algunas de estas prohibiciones, se le es incluso cancelada la visa a ese empresario y a sus familiares, la visa para Estados Unidos.
And so for any business person or investor who does decide to trade with Cuba and the United States then finds out that that's happened, they're then denied entry into the United States for them and their families.
Por favor. Sin embargo, nosotros hablamos ahora de que hay una nueva escalada en el bloqueo hacia Cuba.
However, we're speaking about, in this year alone, there's been an increase in the escalation and strengthening of the blockade towards Cuba.
Una escalada incluso que se basa en falsos argumentos porque no han podido ser demostrados.
So many of these new escalations are based on false information which haven't been able to be proved.
Se habla incluso de los ataques sónicos.
One of the justifications was the sonic attacks in Havana.
Se habla de que en Cuba no se respetan los derechos humanos.
Another justification that people say is that in Cuba we don't respect human rights.
Y eso es importante incluso detenerme aquí porque voy a ponerle un ejemplo.
And it's important to stop here on this issue because I'll give you an example.
Cuba era el único país de América Latina y el Caribe que no tenía un acuerdo de diálogo político y cooperación con la Unión Europea.
So before, Cuba was the only country in Latin America to not have a permanent dialogue established with the EU with regard to political issues and economic cooperation.
Sin embargo, hoy Cuba logró firmar ese acuerdo de diálogo político con la Unión Europea y prácticamente es una legitimación al gobierno cubano y a la democracia que hay en Cuba.
However, today that series of agreements between the EU and Cuba for dialogue on politics and economic cooperation has been finally signed, which for the Cuban government is a legitimization of the progress that has been made.
También hay una falsa noticia que se acusa a Cuba de la situación actual que tiene Venezuela.
Another justification for this past year's increases and intensifications of the blockade is the pretext that supposedly Cuba is the responsible actor for the situation in Venezuela today.
No es verdad. Cuba lo que tiene en Venezuela es un ejército de batas blancas, los médicos cubanos.
Which is not true because the only army that Cuba has in Venezuela is an army of doctors.
¿Ya? Atrás. ¿Cuáles son las nuevas medidas?
But so what are some of these major measures that have been increased in the past year?
Por ejemplo, desde el 2017 se ha incrementado hasta la actualidad una lista de empresas cubanas que no pueden tener relaciones con empresas norteamericanas.
So in 2017, the U.S. State Department announced a list of Cuban restricted entities that could not have any sort of relations whatsoever with any U.S. individual or enterprise.
Nosotros, incluso a partir del 17 del 2014, nosotros hablábamos del posible deshielo que había ocurrido en la segunda parte del gobierno de Obama en cuanto a las relaciones entre Cuba y Estados Unidos.
So during the second term of the Obama administration, in Cuba we spoke about a détente that was happening between the U.S. and Cuba.
De manera tal que hoy se viene prácticamente abajo todo lo que se había alcanzado.
But what we're seeing today is a backtracking of everything that had been achieved during that second term of the Obama administration.
Por ejemplo, se han limitado ya los viajes a Cuba.
So
de los estadounidenses a
many
Cuba.
travel categories through which people from the United States could travel to Cuba have been eliminated.
También se le ha imposibilitado la llegada de los cruceros, se ha eliminado la llegada de los cruceros a Cuba.
And there's also been an elimination of the cruise ships that arrived from the United States to Cuba. Those no longer exist.
También se han limitado las remesas de los cubanos que viven aquí en Cuba a sus familiares, que viven aquí en Estados Unidos a sus familiares que están en Cuba.
There's also been an extreme limitation of the amount in remittances that Cubans living in the United States can send to their family members back in Cuba.
Como por ejemplo, en el gobierno, cuando la administración Obama se le permitía en los 3 meses enviar 2.000 USD a Cuba. Ahora se ha limitado a 1.000 USD trimestrales.
So during the Obama administration, the amount that Cubans could send to their families in remittances had been increased to $2,000 every trimester, and since, that figure has been cut in half.
Y lo más importante en esta nueva escalada tiene que ver con la activación del título 3 de la ley Helms-Burton.
But the most important measure that has been passed in the past year is the activation of Title III of the Helms-Burton Act.
¿Y ustedes saben qué cosa es el título 3?
Does anybody know about the Title III of the Helms-Burton Act?
¿No? Bien, ahora yo voy a explicarle.
That's good, because now I will explain.
El título 3, fíjense bien, incluso yo le dije que me siguieran en los antecedentes.
So that's why I asked you to follow me when I was talking about the antecedents of the U.S. blockade.
El título 3, ¿qué dice?
So what does Title III say?
El título 3 dice que los descendientes, los bisnietos de los que sus propiedades fueron nacionalizadas en Cuba en los 1960, tienen derecho hoy a reclamar esas propiedades en las cortes estadounidenses.
So what this Title III says is that the descendants of those large landowners in Cuba who had their properties nationalized and redistributed at the beginning years of the revolution can now sue in U.S. courts any entity that is operating in their former properties.
Primero quiero que conozcan algo.
So you guys must know one thing.
Cuando surge la Helms-Burton en 1996 con su título 3, la Unión Europea y otros países no estuvieron de acuerdo y querían proteger los intereses que tenían en Cuba, de sus empresarios en Cuba. A partir de ese momento, las administraciones lo que hacían era revisarlo cada 6 meses y no activarlo.
So the important thing to know about the Helms-Burton Act is that when it was passed in 1996, this Title III was never actually activated by any of the administrations since that time. So every presidential administration had the right to not activate this title, which is exactly what happened, because in the EU, there were threats to actually sue the United States in the World Trade Court because all of these lawsuits against Cuba and any actors operating in the property would affect the interests of European companies that had business with Cuba.
Pero incluso en 1960 el gobierno revolucionario pidió que estaba dispuesto a indemnizar, como indemnizó a Canadá, a Reino Unido y a otros países.
And so when these nationalizations of these large properties in Cuba happened in 1960, the revolutionary government at the time was willing to compensate any of these large landowners for the nationalization of their properties, which was what happened with the nationals of the EU, of Canada, and of other countries who had their properties nationalized. They received compensation.
Pero ellos dijeron que no.
But those, either US companies or those who left the United States, said no.
Entonces, para nosotros, los cubanos,
So for us Cubans,
es ilegal la activación del título 3.
the activation of Title III is illegal.
Además, porque en ese mismo año, cuando surge el título 3, nosotros también, desde el punto de vista jurídico, lanzamos la ley sobre la soberanía e independencia del pueblo cubano.
And in the same year, 1996, when the Helms-Burton Law was passed in the United States, us Cubans came up with our own law in the same year, which was the Law for Dignity and Sovereignty of the Cuban People.
Ahora, vamos a ver cuáles son, rapidito, las principales impactos del bloqueo.
And so now we must see what are some of the principal impacts of the U.S. blockade today.
Por ejemplo, en las últimas, es decir, las 6 décadas de aplicación de esa política, le ha traído a Cuba pérdida por más de $138,000 millones.
So over the past 6 decades since the U.S. blockade was imposed onto Cuba, the economic losses amount to over $138 billion.
Y decimos que hay una nueva escalada porque solamente en un año, fíjense bien, entre abril del 2018 y marzo del 2019, las pérdidas son superiores a 4.000 millones de dólares.
And the reason why we say there's a new escalation of the U.S. blockade towards Cuba is because from just April 2018 to March 2019, there have been losses incurred by the Cuban state of over $4 billion.
Tenemos el bloqueo tecnológico.
We have a technological blockade.
Hay pérdidas incluso por reorientación geográfica del comercio exterior. Cuba tiene que darle la vuelta al mundo a veces para situar un barco de alimento y de petróleo en Cuba.
There's losses due to the geographical relocation of Cuba's foreign trade. For example, we have to sometimes go all around the world to just find a ship that will touch Cuban port.
Aquí incluso le traje un conjunto de ejemplos para que vieran cómo impacta, cómo desde incluso hay empresas de otros países que están siendo sancionadas. Ahí, por ejemplo, está una empresa alemana, llamada, ahí está su nombre, que las sanciones puestas a esa empresa suman más de 5.000 dólares.
And so I brought a number of examples of not just U.S. companies, but of foreign companies as well, who have been identified and sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department, which is the example of this German company who's been fined over $5 million for having transactions with Cuba.
También hasta donde pude incluso actualizar la información para traerle, ya hay más de 30 barcos de PDVSA, así como otras compañías de Grecia, Liberia, Chipre y Panamá que están siendo sancionadas por llevar petróleo a Cuba.
And to be able to bring you the most updated information, I also provided the statistic of the over 30 ships and oil liners that belong to the Venezuelan state oil company PDVSA, as well as those of other countries as well, such as Cyprus, Panama, Liberia, and Greece, which have also been identified and sanctioned by the Treasury Department.
Y le digo más.
And even more,
como las pérdidas son tan grandes, hoy las grandes navieras internacionales están pidiendo 12 millones por transportar el petróleo a otras partes del mundo.
And so another important fact is to mention that large oil liners throughout the world, given the risk that they have to run in order to just send oil from Venezuela to Cuba, are now charging $12 million just to pick up Venezuelan oil at their ports.
Tenemos el bloqueo tecnológico.
We also have a technological blockade.
Cuba, ustedes saben que tiene un gran desarrollo incluso en la biotecnología.
So you might know that Cuba has had great strides in its biotechnology sector,
donde han surgido nuevos productos.
In which we've had many new products.
Y a veces es muy difícil a veces patentarlos a nivel internacional.
And oftentimes, because of the blockade, we have difficulty patenting these Cuban inventions on the international copyright market.
Hay afectaciones financieras.
There's also financial impacts as well.
Fíjense, le voy a poner solamente este ejemplo. El Cuba no puede usar el dólar en sus transacciones. Por tanto, hay afectaciones a muchos bancos, tanto en Europa, América Latina, Asia y África, que han querido operar con Cuba.
Another element is that because Cuba is not allowed to make transactions on the international market in US dollars, there are a number of foreign banks and financial institutions who have been identified and fined by the Treasury Department just by having some transaction with a Cuban embassy or a state enterprise that operates abroad.
Solamente en un año, fíjense bien, de junio del 2018 a abril del 2019, hay 9 compañías sancionadas de bancos de terceros países con un monto que asciende a 4.000 millones de dólares.
So in just this last year alone, from June of 2018 to April of 2019, there have been 9 sanctions to foreign companies and banks of third countries, which have totaled over $4 billion.
Se trata de un recrudecimiento del bloqueo.
So what we're talking about here is an extreme strengthening of the blockade on Cuba.
Cuando todos nosotros conocemos, incluso los que están aquí sentados, que la comunidad internacional hace ya más de 25 años que se ha manifestado en contra del bloqueo.
And so we're experiencing this intensification of the blockade, even though, as many of us know, sitting here today, that there's been an extreme rejection of the U.S. blockade towards Cuba by the international community. And we can see that through the votes that are annually voted upon at the UN for the past 25 years.
En las últimas votaciones que se han hecho, solamente 2 países están a favor del bloqueo a Cuba. El resto de la comunidad internacional está en contra del bloqueo a Cuba.
as we've seen in the past votes in the past few years, there's only two countries that are in favor of the blockade, the US and Israel, and every other country is against the blockade.
Entonces yo termino aquí
So I'll finish here.
y a mí me gustaría oír sus comentarios, sus
I would like to
reflexiones.
hear your questions, your comments, and reflections. Can we take a couple of questions and then she answer them all at the same time? That's how she prefers to do it.
So what is the breakdown in the percentages of state-owned enterprises, collectives, and semi-private enterprise?
With the widespread international disapproval of the blockade, what can other countries and people within America actually do to act on that disapproval to help Cuba?
Do you believe that people could possibly use cryptocurrency such as Bitcoin as a way of getting around the economic restrictions, such as the $500 that people can send every 4 months?
Okay.
Why has the blockade continued recently, in particular under the Obama and the Trump administration, which is Democratic and Republican?
Ah, sí. Muy buenas preguntas. Siempre yo cojo estos momentos para el debate, para la reflexión y el enriquecimiento mutuo.
So for me, I love these moments because they serve for reflection, for debate, and for mutual enrichment.
Hay algunas preguntas que me han hecho aquí que son nuevas
So some of these questions that have been asked today are quite new,
y otras se mantienen.
and others I've received before.
Bueno, yo la voy a contestar todas. Primero, voy a empezar por las del bloqueo y voy a terminar por la empresarial. Ahora,
Okay, so I'll answer all the questions, the first one on the blockade and the second about the business opportunities.
por ejemplo, es verdad que hay un rechazo internacional por parte de la comunidad internacional a Cuba con
So-
relación al bloqueo.
So it's true that the international community has widely rejected the blockade on Cuba.
Y yo pienso que eso es legitimar el gobierno cubano
And I think that's a way to legitimize the government of Cuba.
y legitimar incluso nosotros lo que estamos haciendo para desarrollar nuestro proyecto social y que sea socialista.
And it's also a legitimization of our socialist process of development.
Y entonces, lo primero que estamos haciendo, esto es una demostración, ¿no? De lo que pudiera hacerse.
With regard to the question about what we can do in regard to the blockade, what we're doing right now is one of the first demonstrations, right?
Es una demostración para que puedan explicar quizás al resto de los ciudadanos qué significa verdaderamente el bloqueo. Recuérdense que Cuba también el poder de los medios es muy importante.
So this is the first step, right? So we're learning about the impacts of the blockade in a public forum, which can then be spread to other people. And we have to note the power of the mass media in this sense.
Y siempre que me hacen esa pregunta,
And so whenever I'm asked that question,
yo le digo a Lee que él explique, como el estadounidense, qué él cree que ustedes deben hacer para que eliminar el bloqueo, cómo pueden influir en esa política.
and so I always leave the mic to Lee as somebody from the United States, which is our role as people in the United States to lift the blockade, what we can do to further this campaign to end the blockade.
Ah, no, la pregunta es que hay un rechazo internacional y qué ustedes debían
So the
hacer.
question was that there's an international rejection of the U.S. blockade, and so what is it that other countries and people in the United States can do to help lift the blockade?
Entonces yo digo que la primera demostración es esta, oírme a mí, que vengo de Cuba,
And so the first step is to listen to me, who's coming from Cuba,
y ser capaz incluso de decirle al resto de los que no pudieron estar esta noche aquí, qué fue lo que yo dije con relación al bloqueo,
And then the
cómo Cuba entiende el bloqueo, cómo Cuba ve el bloqueo.
So then the next step would be to then go tell other people who weren't able to make it tonight for one reason or another how Cubans understand the blockade, why Cubans aren't in favor of it, and how it's actually affecting the Cuban people and economy.
Pero también cuando me hacen esa pregunta,
But also when that question is asked,
yo siempre le digo a Lee que le explique
I always
como
tell
ciudadano
Lee
de aquí
to explain
qué
as a US
deberían hacer
citizen
ustedes.
what you all should do to lift the blockade.
Entonces explícale, ¿sí?
Okay, so for me, I mean, one of the most important things, and this is from Cubans themselves, the first thing they say is go to Cuba, right? So I think that's one thing that we need to all commit to, right? It's having a physical presence, actually showing up for people and showing like an actual physical presence and solidarity for their movements. That's the first thing that Cubans always say. So even though there's a lot of fear-mongering and backtracking of the travel restrictions towards Cuba, we must continue to go to Cuba and actually be there and not play into this fear-mongering myth. The second that Cubans always say is to lift the blockade. Okay, well, how do you do that? I mean, people have a lot of different strategies, and I think it has to do with what your theory of social change is. How does social change actually happen? Some people think it has to happen through a complete overhaul of our political system, because some of the most compelling data states that people in Cuba, people in the United States, and even the Cuban American community as a majority are not in agreement with the blockade, and yet our political elected representatives aren't able to have the political will to actually reflect the interests of our people, right? So I mean, you could talk about an overhaul of our political system, that's another thing. But from the Witness for Peace perspective, I would say, you know, do grassroots lobbying of your political officials. You know, we are going to Washington, D.C. with Dr. Jourdy. We're going to speak with senators, with Congress people, to talk about, from the Cuban perspective, what the impact of the blockade is, because what they've continued to state over and over again in Cuba is that the only way to lift the blockade is through an act of Congress. So even if we don't have faith in our political leaders, even if we don't think they represent our true interests as citizens, as movements, we have to pass a piece of legislation, and there are pieces of legislation that are currently being introduced. The Freedom to Travel to Cuba Act, the Freedom to Trade with Cuba Act, the Cuba Agricultural Exports Act. So I would encourage everybody to look on congress.gov to understand what the language behind those pieces of legislation are, and to give a call to your local representative. What we've found throughout the country in our regional organizing work is that most congressional representatives haven't heard anything from their constituents about Cuba. It's not their number one priority. So how do we make it a priority for them, right? So that's my 2 cents, but there's a lot of other ways to get involved with this work, and we can talk about it after.
Voy ahora a la segunda pregunta.
Okay, so now the second question.
¿Por qué el bloqueo siguió a pesar de ser el gobierno de Obama y la nueva administración ahora?
Which had to do with your question, sir, with why, given that Obama and Trump administrations, Democratic and Republican administrations, continue this blockade.
Es verdad que con Obama hubo un deshielo en el vínculo económico.
We understand that during the second term of the Obama administration, there was a détente in economic ties, for example.
Pero nunca se planteó la eliminación del bloqueo.
But he never suggested lifting the blockade on Cuba.
Y ninguna de las anteriores administraciones tampoco, ni demócratas ni republicanas.
And none of the other administrations, either Democrat or Republican, ever suggested lifting the blockade either.
Incluso yo digo en estas intervenciones de que se convierte ya en, incluso el tema del bloqueo, nunca se ha aceptado que dentro incluso que en la propia América Latina hay una revolución tan cerca de este país.
And so the way that we understand the blockade, at least one of the major reasons behind it, is that the United States has never been able to accept that so close to its borders, and especially in Latin America, there's a socialist revolution that continues.
Y que Cuba sea libre e independiente.
And that Cuba continues to be free and independent.
Pero ¿saben por qué sigue? Porque también el bloqueo se define a veces en la Florida.
And we also must note that the blockade as a policy, a set of laws, is oftentimes defined in Florida.
Le tengo que decir esto porque, por ejemplo, Vietnam, que también sufrió una guerra por parte de Estados Unidos y ataques por parte de Estados Unidos, tiene un acuerdo de libre comercio con los Estados Unidos, firmado a inicios de los 2000.
So I must mention the case of Vietnam, for example, which even had an open war with the United States, but then in the year 2000 signed a free trade agreement with the United States. So given that reality...
Y entonces, ¿y por qué Cuba no?
So why not with Cuba, for example?
¿Qué es lo que lo hace diferente cuando Cuba solamente fue agredida cuando a Girón y nunca más?
So why is it different with Cuba, we ask? You know, it was invaded at Bay of Pigs, but never again.
La continuidad de los descendientes de los que se fueron en los 60 y que se concentran en la Florida.
So we must mention the descendants of those well-to-do Cubans who left in the beginning years of the revolution, and their descendants continue the same line, the same policy.
Y forman parte también del proceso eleccionario estadounidense.
And this becomes a huge election issue every single year.
A veces Cuba se convierte en el tema de elección.
But Cuba becomes this major election issue in Florida.
Ahora, voy a las otras preguntas.
So I'll go to the other questions.
Con relación a las criptomonedas,
So with regard to the cryptocurrency that you mentioned, sir,
me parece que eso es un buen tema.
I think it's a very good issue to bring up.
Yo tuve la posibilidad de estudiar las monedas mundiales
So I've had the opportunity to study world currencies,
y por supuesto ninguno de los países subdesarrollados de América Latina tenemos una moneda internacional.
and of course, none of the underdeveloped countries of Latin America, of which we're a part, have any globally traded currencies.
¿Por qué? Porque las monedas también tienen que tener una contrapartida.
So because global currencies need to have a counterpart in order to be traded on the global market.
Por ejemplo, muchas monedas también están muy equiparadas al dólar,
So many,
al oro.
so many currencies that are traded on the global market are pegged to the dollar, to gold.
Y si bien hoy ya el oro no es determinante para saber cuándo una moneda puede ser mundial, porque por ejemplo el euro fue emitido y no fue emitido con convertibilidad en oro,
I'll say, for example, the euro is an example of a currency which now today is not pegged to gold, and so it's a globally traded currency.
sino en la credibilidad del Estado que lo emite.
So it has to do with the credibility of the state that emits that currency to be globally traded.
El hecho que se esté hablando de las criptomonedas se convierte en un tema vital para países subdesarrollados,
So-
incluso sancionados y que no pueden usar el dólar.
So as you mentioned, the use of cryptocurrency is of vital importance to underdeveloped countries of the global south who not just having currencies that are not traded on the global market, but who are also sanctioned and targeted by global financial institutions.
¿Para qué? Para estimular el comercio
And this is a way to stimulate trade,
y estimular otro tipo de inversiones
and
financieras.
also a way to stimulate other type of financial investments.
Las criptomonedas tenemos que estudiarlas más,
So we have to study cryptocurrencies more in Cuba.
pero vienen a convertirse en un elemento fundamental para países subdesarrollados, incluso bloqueados como está Cuba.
But this will be an important and vital development for a blockaded and underdeveloped country like Cuba.
Ahora, ¿cómo es la composición del sector empresarial en Cuba?
So with regard to the breakdown of the business structure of Cuba, the question about what percent of state companies, cooperatives, and private enterprises,
Por ejemplo, el sector estatal es predominante en la economía cubana.
we must note that the state socialist enterprise is the predominant element of the Cuban economy.
Alrededor de un 70% son empresas estatales.
About 70% are state companies.
Pero las empresas estatales pueden ser de diferentes formas hoy en Cuba.
But as I mentioned, the state companies today have different forms in Cuba.
Por ejemplo, hay una empresa estatal que es autofinanciada,
There are state enterprises that are self-financed,
que puede cubrir sus gastos con sus propios ingresos.
which can cover its expenses with its own incomes.
Hay una empresa incluso estatal que es presupuestada pura,
So there's even state enterprises that receive all of their financing just from the Cuban state, from the ministries.
y una presupuestada con tratamiento especial diferenciado.
And then there's also state enterprises that are budgeted from the state, but that also have a special and differentiated treatment.
Porque ese tipo diferenciada puede obtener ciertos ingresos, pero el Estado tiene que ayudarla para completar su proceso.
And so this is like a hybrid model in which the state enterprises can receive their own incomes, but then they also received partial financing from the state.
Hoy incluso en Cuba estamos desarrollando la empresa de alta tecnología.
So we're developing high technology state enterprises in Cuba.
Antes de seguir en esto me gustaría decir algo.
So before following on this line, I'd like to clarify one thing.
Y es que en estos momentos tan difíciles para Cuba,
And the point is that during these difficult moments for Cuba,
el gobierno cubano actual tuvo una decisión que nosotros decimos incluso que fue política fuerte, importante en estos momentos, y fue una decisión política.
and so we must note that this summer there was an extremely important, what we call a purely political decision that was made by the Cuban government, which was vital for the country,
Que fue incrementarle el salario al sector presupuestado.
which was to have an increase in the salaries for all state workers.
Nosotros nos pusimos muy contentos
We were very happy after this.
porque los que nos mantuvimos en ese sector por muchos años vimos nuestro reconocimiento.
Because those of us who have decided to stay in the state sector, to be state employees for so many years, we saw the benefits.
Porque, por ejemplo, a veces estar en una empresa autofinanciada,
Because, for example, you can work in a self-financed state enterprise in Cuba.
usted pudiera tener incluso el salario suyo es mucho mayor.
You can have a much higher salary by working in this self-financed state enterprise.
Porque incluso si cumple el plan de producción,
Because what happens is
sobrecumple.
if you overfulfill the production plan,
Puede tener derecho incluso al pago de un mes adicional.
what happens with the workers, if they overfulfill this production plan, they get an extra month of salary, just like 13 months for 12 months of work.
Nosotros le decimos el mes 13.
We call it the 13th month.
Entonces, yo lo dejo ahí y que sigan las preguntas.
So I'll leave it there and we can get some more questions.
So I was wondering whether it's sometimes a loss of energy to wait for the drop of the U.S. blockade, and why isn't Cuba investing more into like markets, for example, with China or with Europe, especially that America is right now, does all these trade wars? Isn't there an opportunity opening up for Cuba to establish new economic relationships?
In terms of the triumph of the revolution, what are the challenges for sustaining the revolution with younger generation that hadn't gone through the U.S. Batista regime in terms of its oppression?
Yeah. So who do you think in the world has unequivocal support for Cuba, both abroad and at home in American Congress? And if there is no unequivocal support, who do you think supports Cuba the most? Which countries and who in American politics?
No, es que las tres preguntas son buenísimas
Okay, so the three questions are all great
y son nuevas.
and they're all new.
Me hacen pensar,
They make me think.
pero eso es lo bueno de estos momentos.
But that's the best thing about these moments.
Evidentemente, Cuba realmente no se ha detenido esperando que quiten el bloqueo.
So Cuba has never stopped hoping that the blockade will be lifted.
El bloqueo sí entorpece,
So the blockade does prevent Cuba from doing many things.
le digo que entorpece porque esa activación del título 3
And I say that it prevents many things because the activation of Title III
va desde el punto de vista económico a impedir, lo que pretende es impedir la inversión extranjera directa en Cuba.
because how we understand it is that the activation of Title III, its main role is to impede any sort of foreign direct investment from any country to Cuba.
Y ahora que Cuba se había preparado para su desarrollo a través de la inversión extranjera directa.
And Cuba had been preparing for many years for foreign direct investment in the economy.
Por ejemplo,
For example,
hoy se está desarrollando en La Habana una de las zonas especiales de desarrollo más importantes de América Latina en el Mariel.
so in Mariel, in the Special Economic Development Zone, Cuba is developing one of the most modern economic zones in all of Latin America.
Una zona moderna donde hay aguas profundas, incluso donde pueden operar buques comparables a los neopanamás.
So in this economic development zone in Mariel, it has a deep water port, it has a high capacity for shipping containers. Many ships coming from the Panama Canal can also come to this zone.
Ya Cuba tiene inversiones extranjeras ahí de muchos países europeos y China.
So Cuba, as you mentioned, has many investments already from European countries and from China as well,
Pero no tantas como quisiéramos.
but not as many as we would hope, of course.
Estamos hablando de que hay presencia de inversión extranjera de Holanda,
So we
de
have
Francia.
foreign direct investment from the Netherlands, from France.
Hay firmas, incluso compañías también de Panamá,
There's firms from Panama,
China.
China.
Estuvo Vietnam, está Vietnam también haciendo su recorrido para invertir.
Vietnam has also been going around the island, figuring out where it can invest.
Por ejemplo, se están dando los principales sectores de la inversión están en la logística,
So some of the major elements of the economy that we're looking for investment in are in shipping and logistics.
Cuba también ya tiene su empresa 100% de capital cubano ubicada en el Mariel
And in this
de
special economic
biotecnología.
development zone for biotechnology, Cuba already has a company operating with 100% Cuban capital.
Miren, cuando ustedes incluso analizan el año 2018,
But if you look at the year 2018,
Cuba recibió visitas de representantes y jefes de gobierno de muchísimos países en el mundo.
just that year alone, Cuba received foreign leaders and representatives from a number of countries all throughout the world.
Por ejemplo, Cuba ya tiene acuerdos de cooperación también con China.
So Cuba has cooperation and agreements with China.
Cuba incluso ha avanzado mucho en cuanto a la revolución energética.
And one example of this is the advances that Cuba has made in its energy revolution.
Estamos hablando de que Cuba ya desde finales de 1999, inicios de los 2000, Cuba comenzó con su revolución energética.
So from the end of 1999 up until the early 2000s, Cuba embarked on an energy revolution.
Estamos hablando de, por ejemplo, empezamos por la campaña de Fidel por el cambio de los bombillos incandescentes por bombillos ahorradores.
So in this process, Fidel encouraged, and there was a whole campaign throughout the island to replace incandescent light bulbs with energy efficient and saving light bulbs.
También tenemos vínculos comerciales con China desarrollados y que nos contribuyeron a esa revolución energética.
And so because of our trade links with China, China was able to help us develop this campaign.
Porque China incluso vende a Cuba productos para la cocina cubana, refrigeradores, ollas, incluso eléctricas, que son ahorradoras.
And so through this energy revolution and up until today, China has been able to sell to Cuba, and you can find in most Cuban homes, Chinese energy efficiency saving devices.
También estamos desarrollando incluso con la cooperación europea y China, sobre todo los paneles solares.
And so also in our development in solar panel production, we've had great cooperation from not just the EU, but also mostly China.
Tenemos también desarrollo con algunos países de la Unión Europea de los parques eólicos.
Also in our wind parks as well, we've had great cooperation from the EU.
Es decir, que Cuba ha ido avanzando en determinadas esferas que son importantes.
So Cuba has been developing in very important spheres of the economy.
La cooperación incluso hoy con la Unión Europea va sobre todo a las cuestiones de clima y medio ambiente.
And so most of our cooperation agreements with the EU are mostly on issues of climate change and the environment.
Todavía nos faltan, enfrentar otras tareas importantes.
We still have other important tasks ahead of us.
Por ejemplo, esa empresa que tenemos en el Mariel de biotecnología, que está incluso dentro de las principales ramas hoy donde se recupera muy rápido la inversión porque tiene que ver con la economía del conocimiento. Cuba la puede desarrollar muy bien, incluso lo está haciendo con el surgimiento de los nuevos productos biotecnológicos.
And so one example of Cuba's task ahead and something that we're already working on is this company that I'm talking about, Via Cuba Pharma, which has 100% Cuban capital, and it shows the great developments in Cuba's biotechnology sector, and which we received a lot of investment to be able to spread throughout the world.
¿Ustedes han oído hablar del Everpro P para la cura del pie diabético?
Have you heard about the Cuban medication Herbiprot P, which is used to cure ulcers due to diabetic foot?
¿Han oído hablar?
Has anyone heard of it?
Eso ha sido muy bueno porque he hablado con muchos médicos, incluso pasaron un reportaje en Cuba cómo con ese producto se elimina en un 90% las amputaciones de cualquier miembro o estructura del cuerpo.
So this is an innovative Cuban pharmaceutical drug that's used through injections for patients who have ulcers due to diabetes in their foot. And reports from Cuban medical professionals have shown that over 90% of amputations that would normally have had to happen have been prevented through the injection of this drug.
Yo estuve muy sorprendida antes de venir para acá de ver un reportaje incluso que pusieron en la televisión cubana de cómo muchas áreas en Venezuela y la gente estaba tan agradecida con el producto porque una vez que comienza a inyectarse comienza el crecimiento celular muy rápido.
So I was even able to see a television report in which they discussed the introduction of this drug into Venezuela and how it confirmed the statistics that 90% of amputations had been prevented because of the rapid cell growth that this medication stimulates.
Incluso ya aquí estoy ligando una de las preguntas que me hicieron con relación a los países que están presentes en Cuba hoy, incluso invirtiendo.
And so by answering this way, I'm also answering one of the other questions, which is the countries that are investing in Cuba today.
Pero a mí me gustaría decirle más.
But I'd like to say even more.
Porque quizás cuando se habla de la inversión extranjera directa, quizás cualquiera puede pensar que vienen a cambiarlo todo dentro de Cuba.
And so it's important to note that when we talk about foreign direct investment, some might just immediately jump to conclusions and say, oh, an investor is just going to come to Cuba and trying to change everything in Cuba, right?
Pero no es así.
But in Cuba, it's not that way.
Cuba desarrolló su nueva ley de inversión extranjera directa.
Cuba developed its new foreign direct investment law.
Una nueva ley moderna.
It's a modern law.
Incluso una ley anticorrupción.
It's an anti-corruption law.
Una ley incluso que le da un conjunto de oportunidades a los inversionistas.
It's a law that gives a series of benefits to investors.
Pero que Cuba también pone su portafolio de inversión. ¿Dónde quiere Cuba que se desarrolle la inversión?
But it's also Cuba that's the one that decides what investment opportunities and projects are the one that the investors will contribute to.
Es decir, Cuba también pone su fuerza de trabajo incluso en una agencia empleadora donde el inversionista llega y puede escoger ahí el personal cubano que necesita. Nadie puede llevar a Cuba y decir, no, eso no se puede hacer. Cuba es un proyecto de participación social y es para todos.
And so, through this foreign investment law, Cuba also provides Cuban personnel to work in these joint ventures and international investments. So the investor has to go to an employment intermediary agency to select which highly trained Cuban workers it wants. They can't just go picking anybody that they want off the street. No, there's a whole process because Cuba is a project for everybody of mass social participation, so it has to be done in an equitable way.
Por ejemplo, en los primeros años de la inversión, el inversionista puede repatriar su dinero sin limitaciones.
So under this investment law, investors can repatriate their incomes without taxes for the first few years.
También en los primeros años no tiene por qué pagar el uso de la fuerza de trabajo.
And the investor also doesn't have to pay any payroll taxes for the first years of the investment as well.
Y las importaciones que hagan también están libres de impuestos en aduana.
And so there's also no customs tax that is charged to the investor in the first few years.
Bien, con relación a la pregunta de los jóvenes.
But with regard to the question about the young people in the revolution.
Sí. Los jóvenes tienen que jugar un papel hoy importante en la revolución cubana porque son continuidad.
And so young people are and must continue to play an important role in the revolution because they are the continuity.
Hoy nosotros estamos desarrollando lo que es el gobierno electrónico.
So today we're developing a whole system of electronic governance.
¿Han oído hablar de gobierno electrónico en Cuba?
Have you heard about Cuba's developments in e-governance?
Y los que más están participando junto con los representantes de los organismos de la Administración Central del Estado en estas redes son los jóvenes.
And so those who are participating most actively in this new form of electronic governance in dialogue with the leaders of the country are the young people.
Por ejemplo, se ha hablado mucho, quizás a nivel internacional, de que se ha dado una gran migración de jóvenes hacia el exterior de Cuba.
So maybe abroad they might talk about the great migration of Cuban young people out of the country.
Pero incluso yo le digo bien, es verdad que hemos tenido la inmigración de los jóvenes, pero la inmigración de los jóvenes por cuestiones ya económicas.
And so while we do have young people who decide to migrate abroad, what we must clarify is that the migration that we're seeing is mostly due to economic reasons.
Pero hoy los jóvenes incluso que están en Cuba se le ha dado un papel importante, incluso muchos de ellos ya son miembros del Consejo de Estado.
And so those young people who are in Cuba, we've given them important tasks and roles in the country. So many young people are members of the Council of State.
Porque hay que oírlos, porque los jóvenes son continuidad.
Because we need to listen to young people, because there's what's going to continue the Cuban Revolution.
Y ellos se parecen mucho a su tiempo, al tiempo que están viviendo.
And we also must pay attention to young people, because they're the ones who reflect what's happening in the moments today.
tenemos una juventud en Cuba que en su mayoría es muy revolucionaria.
The great majority of young people in Cuba, I must confirm, are quite revolutionary.
Y están imbricados en los principales procesos del país.
And they're involved in all the major processes of the country.
Yo le hablaba del gobierno electrónico
I talked about electronic governance
porque en las últimas incluso investigaciones que he estado haciendo, incluso preparándome para venir aquí, había leído cómo había una información del Reino Unido, una investigación que se hizo de la participación en redes y destaca Cuba. En los últimos casi 3 años, Cuba aparece con un crecimiento exponencial de más del 300% de su participación en redes sociales.
And so in my preparation for the speaking tour that I've come to participate in the United States, I read a really interesting report that was published in the UK that talked about young people in Cuba and internet access. And there's been an exponential growth rate over the past year alone of over 300% of Cuban young people are participating in social networks and mobile data access.
Y los jóvenes en Cuba, si bien son revolucionarios, también son contestatarios.
And so even if Cuban young people are revolutionary, they also are contestational.
Es decir, los jóvenes son capaces de decir de una manera bien dicha
So our young people are well prepared to say in a polite way
cómo van cuando las cosas van mal.
when things are going bad.
Son aquellos incluso los que no tienen miedo,
They're the people who don't have fear.
los que participan en la red y son capaces de decirle a un ministro, por
They're
ejemplo,
the ones who are on social media and have the bravery to say to a minister or a cabinet level official,
que hay un problema en una comunidad que está afectando el medio ambiente.
they're able to say, and they've said it, that in one community that I live in, we have an environmental problem at hand.
También, por ejemplo, nosotros hemos visto cómo los jóvenes son capaces de escribir públicamente lo que creen de un determinado problema en Cuba.
And so they've used these spaces to talk about the specific problems that they face in Cuba and to have them heard.
Yo le voy a poner un ejemplo para que
I'll give one example just to illustrate.
antes de yo venir para acá, realmente en Cuba estaba escaseando el tomate, por ejemplo el puré de tomate. Y entró el tomate a una tienda recaudadora de divisas y evidentemente hubo 2 o 3 personas que se llevaron todos los tomates. Pero los jóvenes no se quedaron ahí. Los jóvenes, por lo menos, lo hizo una gente no tan joven, pero que dio una respuesta prácticamente como lo hubiera hecho cualquier joven en Cuba, escribió lo que estaba sucediendo.
Okay, so there was an example right before I came to Cuba, and this is a very illustrative example, in which there was a scarcity of tomato paste in the stores. You know, we have scarcities oftentimes because of the economic situation, and so at one of these stores, somebody in the long line decided to just bring 2 and 3 of his friends up to the front of the line and to buy all the tomato paste of the very little that there was in the store.
Y por tanto, ayudó a los tomadores de decisiones a resolver ese problema.
And so what the young people in the store did was they went right to Twitter, they tagged the Minister of Internal Commerce so that that person could know what the situation was, and that helped the decision makers, those who actually decide what happens with the distribution of tomato paste throughout the country, to actually go to the site and to figure out what happened and to take action.
Entonces, ¿ustedes creen que en Cuba no hay democracia?
So you think in Cuba there's no democracy?
Sí, eso es democracia.
So that's democracy.
Eso es incluso participación social.
So that's social participation.
Para que los tomadores de decisiones sepan por dónde están las cosas malas en Cuba.
So that decision makers can know where to get at the problems in Cuba.
Yo pienso que Cuba no es un paraíso, incluso ustedes lo han visitado.
So I don't think Cuba's a paradise, especially those of you who have visited know that.
Pero tampoco es el infierno que nos quieren hacer presentar.
But it's also not hell, which is the way that it's presented.
Sí, porque a veces te asoma a cualquier prensa y ve cómo hablan, prácticamente demonizan a Cuba.
Because we can see how all the mass media speaks poorly and practically demonizes Cuba.
Y yo me siento feliz de vivir allí.
But I feel happy to live there. Ana ya dice que
¿Eh?
Yeah.